Well, good evening and welcome. We're glad that you could be a part of this really important discussion that we called Awareness, Advocacy, and Action. It's a follow-up to the Considering Matthew Shepard concert. Hopefully you were able to attend last week. But it's obviously addressing topics of social justice related to LGBTQ plus issues. We do want it to be a discussion, and so before I introduce the two panelists, I just want to say, hopefully you got an index card when you came in, and if not, let us know. And if you have a question at any time during it, just write it down. Legibly would help, and hold it up, and Bryce or somebody will come and get it, and we'll get those up to Brian. And can't guarantee we'll get to all the questions, but hopefully we can, because we're allowing time for that. So, introduction-wise, I'm happy to introduce my good friend Brian Ellison, who is a Presbyterian minister and a very good preacher who preached here not too long ago. He currently serves as the executive director for the Covenant Network of Presbyterians, which is working for more inclusive policies related to LGBTQ plus persons. In addition, a lot of people may recognize his voice. He's a public radio journalist who can often be heard on KCUR. And he and his partner, Troy Lilleboe, live in Midtown, Kansas City. So, Brian, welcome. And then Senator Greg Razer, a Democrat, is the state senator for the 7th Senatorial District, having previously served 2 terms in the Missouri House. And before that, he was deputy regional director for U.S. Senator Claire McCaskill. He received his bachelor's degree in history from the University of Missouri-Columbia, and his election to the Senate in 2020 made him only the 2nd ever openly LGBT plus member of the Missouri Senate. And his advocacy on these issues has been featured on such outlets as Dateline, Politico, and the New York Times. Senator Razer, welcome. We're glad you're here. Would you please help me welcome both of them?
Thank you so much, and thank you, Senator Razer, for
Thank you. Good to be here.
Opportunity to talk. Usually when we talk, it's over Zoom or over headphones, and for a very short amount of time about some specific piece of legislation. So yes. I'm glad to have a little longer conversation.
A little more broad this time.
Yes. And a little more personal, and I actually want to start with the personal. Awareness, advocacy, activism. Action. There was a time when this was going to be a panel discussion, and yet I think you capture all of those elements, actually, in your life and your work. This event comes after a concert that was remembering the life of Matthew Shepard. He died 25 years ago this week.
Doesn't seem that long ago.
It doesn't. And he was 22 when he died. You, that same week, were 20 years old.
That's right.
I've read, if I'm doing the math right, that you actually came out 4 months after that. And I'm wondering if you could take us back to 20-year-old Greg Razer and tell us what life was like for you then, before you came out, and we can then talk about what it was like after.
Sure. I was a student at Mizzou, outwardly living a great life, and it was a lot of fun, but turmoil inside because I was getting tired of being an actor. And it had been 20 years of acting the way someone else wanted me to act, or how I was expected to act. It was 20 years, and I'll never forget a conversation we had in college about clothes that you wear. And I said, well, you wear clothes based on what other people want to see of you. That you're trying to attract that girl, or you're trying to attract that boy, or you're trying to make this person happy, so you wear clothes to reflect it. 8 years I worked for Claire McCaskill, I wore very conservative clothes. I'm already going to Northwest Missouri as a gay liberal Democrat. Let's not wear this suit while I'm at it.
I love that suit, by the way.
Thank you.
I just want to say that right now.
And
the shoes, yes.
Thank you.
That's right.
So I am trying to overcome that. But there was a lot of anger built up inside. And a confluence of things kind of came together at the same time in media and in politics in the world. Matthew Shepard, there was, and y'all are welcome to laugh at any time at some of these stories. Dawson's Creek had a character come out, and that was very powerful. And at the same time, The Real World, do y'all remember that show? Had a cast member named Danny, who was very relatable, seemed like he would be one of our friends. Turns out, 25 years later, he's one of my best friends, and talked to him today. But those things all kind of came together, and internally it just built and built until finally one night I said, I'm just not doing it anymore. And I sat my roommate down, and it took me about 10 minutes to just get the words out of my mouth, I'm gay. And I remember just sitting there shaking, because I could have lost my best friend, my roommate, therefore my financial stability, all in one whack. And thankfully, we were sitting there, and there was a long pause. And he said, well, I guess I have 2 questions for you. And I said, okay, what's that? And he said, well, I need to know if you're in love with me. And I was like, no, Chris, I'm not in love with you. What's your second question? He said, well, if you're gay, why isn't this apartment decorated better? And my friends all joked that I didn't come out of the closet, I kind of exploded out. Once it was over, and it's been 25 years of trying to figure out who I am now.
Let's go even further back to why you were in the closet in the first place. You've shared about growing up in small town Missouri, in a conservative church, conservative family. How is it that kids, from your own story, how is it that kids find themselves first coming to some self-realization and then pushing all that down?
So I grew up in a town of about 400 people in the Boot Hill, just outside of town on a cotton farm. My family were cotton farmers. And the name of the little town is Cooter. You're welcome to laugh. I usually just pause for it. But I remember, do you all remember the Charlie Brown episode or series where he had a crush on the little redhead girl and wanted to keep her hands warm, was always trying to buy her mittens? Well, I remember I was 5 or 6, and it was the first day of t-ball practice or whatever practice you have, and my little redhead girl was on the team. I didn't know what these feelings meant, but like, whoo, my palms would get sweaty when he would come around. And I remember my mom and my sister and this old Grand Marquis that we had at the time in the front seat, and I'm sitting on the hump in the back. Y'all remember the hump in the back? And we're driving home, and they're asking me about practice, and I remember thinking, don't mention this. Don't mention this kid. I don't know what's wrong with it, but something doesn't compute. And so I never told anybody. And I effectively closeted myself at 6 years old. And everything after that was, am I holding my leg like this, like the men do, not like this, like the women? Like every gesture you start to analyze. At least I did. Every single thing I did was under a microscope, my own microscope, to make sure that nobody could tell.
You know, my partner, Troy, who I know you know, tells a story, and he didn't come tonight, so I can tell his stories for him. Tells a story of when he was probably about that age. Dukes of Hazzard was the popular TV show, and he remembers with great clarity the kids going around and saying who their favorite character was on the show, and every boy said Daisy Duke, of course, except he knew that his favorite was Bo, but he also knew, just as you said, that he wasn't supposed to say that. And so he said Daisy, of course.
Now, was Bo the brunette or the blonde?
Brunette.
The brunette.
There,
Okay.
Of course it was the brunette, Greg.
Yes, yes, of course.
Right. But it does occur to me that we as a culture, as a society, have built in these expectations in such a way and to such depth that even a 6-year-old picks up on them.
At 6 years old, I knew it. I knew it because of what I saw from friends and family, what I heard in that very conservative church. I mean, for the first 18 years of my life, we were in church every Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night. And at least once, each one of those times, 3 times a week, somebody on a podium, I was going to say like this one, but it's not at all like this one, would say that I'm going to hell. And that was just reinforced and reinforced. And we would sit around the dinner table, and you would hear, slurs used by dad or grandpa. Go to school and you would hear the same thing from students and your peers. And that wears on you after a while. And I tried everything. I tried praying the gay away. That doesn't work. I tried being a bad kid, and that didn't work. And finally, my senior year in high school, there was just no other alternative. I knew I could never come out. I knew I could never fall in love or have my heart broken. I knew I would never experience the excitement of a real first date. And if you couldn't do that, then what's the point of continuing? And so the winter of 1996, I nearly killed myself. There was a night, and this is a really fun story to get to tell on the Senate floor, by the way. But yeah, there was a night in February of 96 where the notes were written, the weapon was there. I was that close. But thankfully I survived. And someone pointed out to me, another legislator came up and he had heard me use that phrase that I survived my hometown. And he said, everyone I know who's LGBT that grew up in rural communities uses the word survived. And I said, well, yeah, that's what we had to do. It's just what we had to do, survive and get out. And that's really a shame for those small communities. You know, we shouldn't, now I love Kansas City, I've been here 22 years, this is home. But we shouldn't have to migrate to a metropolitan area to be who we are.
How different would you say it is today in places like Cooter, in other parts of Missouri?
So I'm shocked. Cooter, Missouri now has about 350 people. They have 2 openly gay students, a lesbian student, and a trans student. And no, the kids don't care, and I guess the parents tolerate them. I'm still friends with the president of the school board, and he said when the trans student came out, there was a big uproar about, well, where is she going to go to the bathroom? And they, you know, having all sorts of crazy discussions, and he finally just put his foot down and said, we've got that huge janitor's closet right there. We're going to renovate it and make it an all-gender restroom. Problem solved. And no one has fussed about it since.
You know, I think a lot of folks hear stories like that. They see it's not just 2 or 3 TV characters who are openly LGBTQ, it's many celebrities, a handful of athletes, and they think, mission accomplished. Progress has happened. We celebrate it. Why are people still making such a big deal about the need for progress, the need for protections, the need for equality, when things have improved so much?
Well, first of all, things have improved so much. They really have. In the last 25 years, there's been tremendous progress. So much so that I think that my generation was probably the last to be taught how to be an activist. We had just gotten the medicine that would control HIV. So that activism was winding down. And before that, it was kind of the Harvey Milk, Anita Bryant era, and that had just kind of been put on the back burner as we were saving our lives. But once I became active and an advocate, things started going to the Supreme Court, and we just won and won and won and won, and we really became party planners instead of advocates. That's not going to happen with the courts anymore. But society has changed to the point, and I made this point during debate, made it very loudly, that because of the changes in society, they can't attack me as a gay white man anymore. That's just politically not allowable. So now they're going after kids. And kids that they admittedly don't understand. And I think it's very important to make this distinction. If any of you here don't understand exactly who transgender people are or what the process is to, you know, the transition process, that's okay. This is a new issue for the vast majority of Missourians. But if you don't understand, and you're also a member of the Senate, maybe don't introduce legislation around it. And that's what they did this past session.
You made that speech more than once, probably, during the last
Yes.
legislative session. You've also talked about, you have a pretty positive reputation for being one of the senators, one of the Democrats who will reach across the aisle.
Oh.
You have good relationships with a lot of the Republicans. How do they respond when you say, if you don't understand this, stop talking about it, stop introducing legislation?
They're very uncomfortable about it. I would say amongst the Republicans, the more rural that they are, tends to be the ones that gravitate to me the most. I understand what's going on in their small rural communities. I can relate what's happening right here at home in rural terms, or vice versa. I find myself as a translator, I feel like, a lot between urban and rural legislators. They get put in those positions because of extremists that are being elected. And if, just as an aside, the Missouri State Senate has 34 members. 10 of us are Democrats, 24 Republicans. But amongst those 24, there's about 8 that have splintered off. They call themselves the Conservative Caucus. Another Republican from here in the region calls them the Chaos Caucus. I don't know what they stand for, what they want, other than to make sure that the government doesn't function. But they keep introducing these bills and then putting pressure to get them to the floor. Or they will offer amendments that put their Republican colleagues in terrible positions, and they are actively trying to run candidates against them to get those Republicans out and their type in. So there's a lot of friction there. But they get put in these terrible positions, and they tend to vote along the party line. Those votes are party line votes, and they come up to me afterwards and say, Greg, it's just politics, it's not personal. Now, one of those votes, I put them in the position. This was the year after COVID, and there was an amendment made to a bill that said that no municipality that has a public transit system can refuse transit to someone who doesn't want to wear a mask. You can't mandate a mask on a bus. I thought, well, here's an opening. So I put an amendment on the amendment that said, and you can't discriminate against LGBT people on riding the bus. And it failed by 1 vote, which is depressing that it failed by 1 vote. But it's also just 1 vote. We're down 24-10. We got a lot of people on our side there. So we're making progress slower than I wish. The legislature is behind where society is.
And why is that? Because I think a lot of where I hope tonight's conversation goes is sort of what can people do about things, but to be able to do anything, they have to understand the dynamics. And it's a little bit hard to understand how we can talk about the progress and all the changes and how there's 4 openly queer kids in Cooter, Missouri, and yet that doesn't seem to be reflected in the tone and tenor or votes of what happens in Jefferson City, or for that matter, Topeka, or a lot of other state capitals, or school board meetings, or city council meetings around the state. Why is that? Why is there that disparity still existing between the votes and the lived reality of a lot of people now?
It's because of who votes in political primaries. It's turning out and voting in primaries. So we talk a lot about gerrymandering, and I want us to put that aside for a second. The bigger issue is we are self-segregating by political ideologies. If you are conservative, and the more conservative you are, the more likely you are to live in rural areas. And conversely, the more liberal you are, the more likely you're to live right here. So when we are up for re-election, and I will be soon, but that's neither here nor there, I don't have to worry about a Republican beating me. This is like 81% Democratic. There's just no way. What I do have to focus on is making sure no one beats me from the left in the primary. What they have to focus on is making sure no one beats them from the right. So they can't get too moderate. there's no incentive to compromise because you're going to lose your job, especially if it's an issue that you don't particularly feel passionate about. You might just go ahead and vote the party line because you want to be there for the next vote. That's the one that you're willing to be sent home for. So we have that problem across the state in almost all of our districts. The saying is, or the thought is, if you get 55% of the vote, you're in a safe district. Anything above that is a wasted vote. Not really wasted, but a vote that would have been helpful somewhere else. I got something like 80% of the vote. Now, if we could have took that, 25, 30% to Eastern Jackson County or to a rural district, then you start flipping seats. But the same holds true in their districts. There's no way Democrats can win them in a lot of these. So there's no incentive to come to the middle. There's no incentive to compromise. And it gets very frustrating.
Given that situation is likely to be the case for a while, take us into the mind of legislators, and for that matter, voters, as we think through what the world could look like. You've really staked a lot of your time and energy around these anti-trans pieces of legislation this year. What would it look like for that to be different than it was this year in Jefferson City? How would legislators who are likely to be in the same proportions of Republican and Democrat, voters who are likely to turn out in similar numbers to what they've been turning out, how would that be different?
It probably won't be different. So the one piece I left out of that story about population shifts is the people that actually vote in primaries are your hardcore believers, your hardcore Democrats and your hardcore Republicans, your base. You don't get a lot of moderates that come out and vote. And so whoever wins the primary wins. How will it be different? It may not be a trans issue next year. I suspect it will be. I suspect I can throw out a couple of 3 ideas, that one of them will be it. But it could be, I think they came in last year thinking critical race theory was the big hot button issue. Then I think a poll was done and they said, stop the presses. Look at how this polls. Look at what Missourians think about trans kids on hormone therapy. And they switched gears, none of them knowing what they were talking about. I think the same thing is going to hold true this year. It's an election year. 5 members of the Senate are running for statewide office, 2 of them against each other, all on the other side of the aisle. A 6th, if you include one on our side of the aisle. It's going to be messy. It's going to be dysfunctional. I don't think a lot gets done. And in an election year that's this politically charged, not getting a lot done is a good thing.
The Democrats have said for several years now, the less that the Senate does, the better, the more they feel like they've accomplished their goals.
We did very little last year. I think it was the least number of bills passed and sent to the governor other than the COVID year in Missouri history. The one terrible bill we did pass was the trans health bill. But of all the states in the country that passed a bill, we were the only ones to get compromise. I'd started a filibuster and my colleagues held the floor for 3 days while we compromised on that bill. I was going somewhere with that, and Brian, it just went out of my head.
That's all right. Since you brought up the anti-trans legislation, the trans health bill, I wonder if you could help us understand a bit of what is really at stake in that conversation. Why should people care about the particularities of the medical procedures that are allowed for a fairly small percentage of the population? Talk about why that matters.
So this might be a long-winded answer, and I apologize, but I think it's important. I get asked a lot of times, Greg, do you really believe these kids? And I tell them the story of me being 6 years old. I'm like, if I knew I was gay at 6, why am I not going to believe this kid? So let's say you're a young kid, you're 10 or 11, and you go to mom and dad and say, I know you think I'm a boy, but I don't feel like a boy. I've never understood why you put me in a tuxedo on Easter Sunday when I want to be in a dress. And so what happens at that point, the kid's not yet to puberty, is you start therapy. Let's make sure this is right. You'll have a year of therapy, a year of living as the other gender, your real gender. And then once puberty hits, then you start hormone blockers. So this is particularly important for male to female transgender individuals. It stops the body from growing into that big male body. The broad shoulders, Adam's apple, big hands. It makes it easier later in life to pass in society as the gender you really are. You can stay on puberty blockers for 3 or 4 years. You hit about 16, and then you start taking the appropriate hormones. So then your body starts to grow as the gender it is. Now, a lot of people ask, is this a real thing? You know, what if these kids change their minds? What if this is just a fad? Just the cool kids are doing it. These are all questions that were asked me during negotiations. And, you know, first of all, you show me a high school in America where it's cool for a boy to show up in a dress, and I'll eat my hat. I mean, that's just a brave thing to do because it's not cool anywhere. Is it a fad? Won't you grow out of it? Now, finally, I looked at the senator. I said, didn't you say all those same things about me 30 years ago? Well, it's just a fad. He'll find the right girl eventually. I ain't found her yet.
Same.
So these kids are going through something real, and it's hard. You know, I said, I like boys. They're saying I am a boy. That's a tough thing to do. And I had another senator ask me, you know, do you want them in your city? And I said, do I want people that are brave enough at that young of an age to stand up against all this, against, you know, possibly their parents? They're turning on the news and they see that the Missouri Senate is talking about them. And they're brave enough to stand up and say, I'm going to be who I am, whether you like it or not. And I'm going to move forward with my life, being my true self. Yes, I want them here. It's exactly who I want moving to Kansas City. And I think Kansas City would embrace anybody who's different, quite frankly.
Why does it seem that, you mentioned earlier, it got harder to attack you as a white gay man. Mm-hmm. They turned to somewhere else. What are the implications of the differentiation of the LGBTQ community? That is, do you think that there is still a united front? Are the challenges that the trans community is facing right now something that other parts of the queer community has been willing to embrace? How are you seeing that dynamic play out?
So there's been that division for a long time between lesbian, gay, bisexual members of our community and trans members of our community. You could see that in the first Pride, 1970, after Stonewall, the year after. They didn't know whether or not to let trans individuals on the stage to speak. Did we want that image out there? I think our community, by and large, has come together and said, yes, we are a community. And I think what really makes us the community are those questions we were being asked. People don't believe we are who we say we are. And I think what has happened over time is we have focused on gay white men. We've kind of made ourselves the focus. I mean, look, we're sitting up here. But I think the trans community is about 30 years behind. 30 years behind where we are. So if you go back 30 years and think it's 1993. So you have Melissa Etheridge coming out. You have, we're nearing the end of the worst years of HIV and AIDS. And we were everywhere, seemingly. On TV, there were more gay people than ever. It must be this cool fad. Well, it's not a cool fad. Society was changing, and people like me in places like where I grew up were now brave enough and comfortable enough because of the people that came before us to come out. So there weren't more gay people, there were just more of us being honest. And I think we're seeing that today. I had somebody say, Greg, if they just wouldn't throw it in our face so much, if they just wouldn't do that. And I said, did you say that about us in '93? Think about it. Yes, we do have to throw trans people in your face. You've got to be shocked a little bit, and then you're going to go, shock and awe. They're not so bad after all. And I think that's what we're experiencing. The good news is we have the blueprint. We already know through history how this ends. And unfortunately, I get to serve in the Senate at a time when we lose a little bit. But if you think about every battle the LGBTQ community has gone through, whether it's the 50s and not being able to work in the federal government, Stonewall in the 60s, the 70s, it was Anita Bryant, trying to get the funding from the federal government to research and find a cure or help for HIV and AIDS, all the way to these last couple of decades with marriage and don't ask, don't tell, non-discrimination policies. We always lose at the beginning. We always lose those first 2 or 3 battles, and then the tide changes, and we win. And that's going to happen again this time. We have to make sure the losses are as minimal as possible. That's what I tried to do this year. I hope I succeeded. We got a 4-year sunset on this terrible bill that we passed. So in 4 years, the law simply disappears and goes away. So I think that was a victory.
And yet, even with that provision of that law and also the grandparenting in of people currently receiving treatment that was built into that law as a concession, programs in Missouri are shutting down.
They are.
Which speaks to the limitations of what legislation can accomplish when there's other pressures, political, maybe economic. Where else, in order to accomplish the kind of openness and changes in society you're talking about, where else do those who would be activists, those who would be advocates, need to get involved besides turning out to vote?
Well, first of all, you got to vote. That's the very first thing. I would say the second thing, and I brought this up in my comments the day of the vote, if you're lesbian, gay, or bisexual, you probably weren't there in the Capitol this year. So the rest of the community needs to wake up. Our community's under attack right now, and they're attacking our children. They're attacking kids that they don't understand. I was a kid that wasn't understood. I take this very personally. So if you're here and you're LGB, it's time to get back to work because they're back at it. I think for the rest of us, it can be something as small as Thanksgiving's around the corner. Somebody in your family says something, makes a joke about trans people. Just speak up and say, that's not appropriate. That's not okay. That makes a big difference. Just speak up, speak out. Go to that rally. Be seen, be heard, write a letter. One of the things that is really disappointing when our political districts and boundaries are drawn the way they are, you're all going to be writing me, saying, please support trans people. Well, you know, probably save the stamp. I appreciate getting positive feedback too, but it becomes difficult because kind of the votes are already cast, and we get to talking about specifics. But I think the most important thing is just to be known as an ally, as someone who says, even if I don't fully understand, I want people to have the promise of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And if this makes them happy and that's the best you can get to, then God love you. Like, go be happy. That's what we're all here for.
I want to remind folks that if you want to ask questions, you can fill out one of the cards and hold it up, and someone will pick it up and bring it up to me. Not everyone here is necessarily from this church or any church, and yet a lot of religious people part of religious communities want to be part of this conversation, recognizing that religion and faith, even in your own story, has often been a negative impact on the rights and the equality of LGBTQ people. What do you see as the role for people of faith or people involved in religious communities today to have an impact on showing support for the LGBTQ community, whether it be in the legislative arena or even just in daily life?
Well, I think religion is the dominant factor in the United States, second mainly or mostly only to the dollar. Mm-hmm. Those two things have the biggest impact on legislation, the dollar and the Bible. I think churches that are accepting have to be louder about that acceptance. They have to become the mainstream, because whether the numbers show it or not, I'm not sure. But the sentiment in the Capitol building is, well, that's lefty, not real city churches. You've got to get the message out, no, we are the dominant sect of Christianity, of Judaism, of whatever your religion is. You've got to get that message across, that when it comes to Christianity, this is the way the majority of us think. Because I promise you, the Southern Baptist lobbyist in the Capitol is not preaching that message. I forget what the new guy's name is. The other one passed away last year. But he was very active, very loud, wrote a newsletter, never could spell my name right. Like, if you're going to make up quotes that I said, at least spell my name right. I told him that one day, and he and I didn't get along a whole
Really?
lot.
That's surprising.
It is surprising, yeah.
Are you hopeful? Are there stories that give you hope about progress? I mean, there's a lot that you've shared tonight that does not seem very hopeful.
I'm hopeful because I love history. I absolutely love it. And I know history and I know how this ends. So long as we all work towards it, we already know the ending. In 30 years, this will not be an issue. Kansas City, the state of Missouri has only had 2 openly LGBT members of the Senate ever, and they both come from right here in this district, myself and Jolie Justice. I'm very proud of Kansas City for that. Mm-hmm. It's time for St. Louis to step up, maybe Columbia. Springfield's getting close. But in 25, 30 years, there will be an openly trans senator, and most likely from this district. And I look forward to that day. Somebody will sit in my seat, maybe in my literal seat. That's a funny story. If we have time, I'll tell it. But that day's coming. And one example I'll have is one of my colleagues who is very passionate, not about the medical side, but about the sports side. Remember when this was just about saving women's sports and Republicans discovered Title IX all of a sudden? This senator was very passionate about it. And I pulled them aside and asked them a question, what would you think about this amendment or that amendment to the bill? And I said, the hope is we get to a point in society where these kids can come out early enough that we get them on puberty blockers, and then the senator finished my sentence for me. Their body never grows into those big male bodies, and it's not boys taking on girls. I was like, you got it. And the senator said, I don't know if we're doing the right thing anymore. And it's anecdotal, but it's one person who, through that debate, was having second thoughts.
But it didn't change how they voted.
Not this time. Not this time. But 5 years from now, when this issue comes back up, or 4 years from now, will they say, no, we're not going to file a bill to renew this law? No, when they're in their Republican caucus, they're going to put their foot down and say, no, that's over. That was 4 years ago's dividing issue. We found a new one. Let that one go. And there will be a new one. That's my hope. And you're not going to get everything overnight. You're not going to get everyone to understand overnight. You're not going to get your friends to understand overnight. But you've got to make progress. It's what I tell people who come to lobby legislators. If you come and lobby a legislator and they are 20% on your side and 80% against you, and you turn that to 40-60, that's a huge victory. They're still going to vote against you. But maybe next year a similar bill comes up and they've learned a little bit more and now they're undecided. Or maybe they vote with you. You've got to move the needle, and the needle's being moved.
Talking about your history and about the fact that you're the only LGBTQ member of the Senate right now. Someone asked, Senator, how did you decide to run for office? I do have to wonder that even as comfortable as you were, even exploding out of the closet, even with time in D.C. working for Claire McCaskill, that couldn't have been an easy decision. There's something you're still putting on the line as an openly gay person seeking office.
One thing I put on the line is coming out to my dad, which I'd never done. My dad lives in Alabama and is a Trump-loving, Rush Limbaugh, used to be listening to crazy person. And my family had put a lot of pressure on me not to tell him. He'll have a heart attack. He'll die right then. And even though you know it's not true, it's still in the back of your mind. You're like, God, what if he did? So I called him and said, hey, I'm going to run for office, and I'm going to do it as an openly gay man. And he's like, yeah, I kind of figured you're whatever age I was, and you're not married. It's like, yeah. He said, all right, so how much money are you going to have to raise? And that's all that was said about it. And we moved right on. But why did I run for office? I remember the first presidential campaign I can really remember understanding what was happening was in 1988, George H.W. Bush and Michael Dukakis. And my mom made me sit and listen to the speeches by both candidates. It'd be back-to-back weeks. And I asked her, why do we have to sit here and listen to this? And she said, well, these are the people, and I was 10 at the time, these are the people that are going to decide how much do we spend on our schools and our roads, and kind of explained it in the way you would a 10-year-old. And I said, okay. She said, it's our responsibility to listen to them both, listen to their ideas, and decide which one will be better. And I'm listening to whoever went first, and I thought, well, I don't want to vote for the person that decides, I want to decide. And so it's always kind of been there. I was working for Claire, our former state representative, Jeremy LaFavor, came to me and said, I'm not going to run for re-election, but I think Jefferson City needs you. I think I'm still the only member of the legislature who has spent significant periods of my life in the most rural and the most urban parts of our state. So it's a unique capacity that I have. But he talked me into it. I won. We have term limits in Jeff City. The Senate seat opened up. You have a lot more influence in the Senate than you do the House, so I ran for that and won. And we'll see what's next. I have no idea.
Oh, yeah. What's next? Okay, sorry. That was KCUR talking there for a second. How can we address the problem of social media spreading disinformation about the queer community?
About everything. About everything. I don't know. I don't have that answer. I would be making a lot more money if I did. It's a real problem, and I can tell you, I see it in my mother, who is, Corey back there has met her. She's the sweetest woman you ever want to meet. She instilled in me that you vote every single time. It does not matter if it's for dog catcher, you vote. Now, she would never tell you who she voted for, but you vote. Now, I guarantee you in 1992, she voted for George H.W. Bush for president and Mel Carnahan for governor. She was that kind of a voter. And also this fact that even if you disagree with the politics, you always respect the office. Always, if you don't like your state representative or you don't like the president, you still call them Mr. President. And within just a few years, with her sitting there, she quilts, she's on her iPad, refreshing Facebook all day with Fox News playing. She has just changed, and she is this hard, right-wing woman now, and I don't recognize her sometimes. And it's the power of social media and a news conglomerate run by a political party. And it has changed her and millions of our fellow Americans. And let's not mistake what MSNBC is. It's supposed to be the alternative. You're not getting the news on either one of those stations. You're getting political commentary. And it can be entertaining, but it's not Walter Cronkite. I miss Walter Cronkite and Dan Rather and Tom Brokaw. So
Those days seem to have passed.
but yet
Because those are dependent on a certain level of trust in institutions, in a belief that there was neutral, objective, shared set of facts that we agree on.
So here we sit in the state that's home to the world's first and still the best journalism school at Mizzou. I don't know why it can't take a lead on figuring out how to do this. And I've always wanted and wish it could happen, whether it's KCUR, KCPT, the Star, to come together with a nightly newscast that was actually the news. This is what happened in Jeff City, Topeka, City Hall. Here's the weather. The Chiefs won. Good night. It's always going to be in the bottom of the ratings, but could you get enough to keep it on the air? And that's what I would go to every night. And then also losing the fairness doctrine, I think, has been devastating. The doctrine that said if you're a news network, you have to give both sides of an issue. Well, we don't have to do that now, so it just doesn't happen.
Someone wants to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit, to clarify a little bit back to the transgender issue. This person says they work with kids in the system. They've had students change their preferred pronouns and names multiple times over several weeks. Kids at age 11 to 14, do they know really who they are? Does any kid really know who they are at those ages? When are brains fully developed enough to make a physical, permanent change to their body? I think the question is asking, are trans kids really as wise and able to self-determine their futures as you're saying?
Absolutely, and I think that's a fair question. So one thing with puberty blockers, let's say you hit puberty at 12. You start puberty blockers. There's nothing permanent about that. You come off of puberty blockers and puberty starts. Want to dispel this myth of minors having physical surgeries, gender reassignment surgeries. It doesn't happen. I don't want to say it's never happened because somebody will find one person somewhere in Oregon or something, but it does not happen. In fact, of all transgender people, only about 10% ever have a gender reassignment surgery for a number of reasons, including the fact that health insurance isn't going to pay for it, and that's pretty expensive. So surgeries just aren't happening with minors. And then with the hormones, you can reverse that as well. Now, there will be some, by that point, you're 17-ish, when you start 16, 17, depending on your gender. There could be some permanent effects, but it's nothing that is, what's the term I'm looking for? Nothing that is going to be life-changing or dangerous in any way. So I think these kids know who they are. I mean, at 13, did you know that you were a boy or that you were a girl? Did you question it? I didn't. Like, I knew I was a boy. I just thought the other boys were hot. And I never questioned that either. And so I think these kids know who they are. And one thing I would point out, I think we all agree that there are some children that are born with both sets of genitals or ambiguous genitalia. And when they come out of the womb, the family and the doctors don't know which gender this kid is, which to me is the proof that there is not a direct correlation between the gender of your body and the gender of your brain. And those two things form at separate times in your development. And I think these kids, and And look, we're still talking about a very small minority of people. That happens sometimes. The brain forms one gender, the body forms another, and these kids just want to match. They want to be who they are. And we are who we are here, not here.
There's a question about being an ally. There was a story this week where a gay man was harassed, and what was said to him was, "Boy, you better be careful or you'll become the next Matthew Shepard." So if we were in that room where that was said, or other threats, other cruelties, what should we say or do? What's the Thanksgiving dinner table aside, sometimes we have to confront really terrible things. What should we say or do?
Is this a eye for an eye or a turn the other cheek type church? That's where my thought went. If you're bigger than that person, I'm jumping up and getting in their face. I'm just being totally honest. That is completely unacceptable. Completely unacceptable. If you're not bigger, then you better shout louder. You cannot say something like that. That is beyond inhumane. And I bet, that's a person that I would have grown up with. I bet that person went to my church. I don't know what else to say. I would lose my mind if that was said in front of me.
It speaks to me of yes, we've made all this progress, and yet that still happens. And we know that happens. That's not actually even an isolated incident.
No. And we've made a lot of racial progress, but we've also seen that it's okay to start saying racist things again. I think Donald Trump has allowed that to happen, that racists didn't go away, they just got shamed into the closet. We've got to shame more people into the closet and then try to change their minds while they're in there. But yeah, that's always going to be around. I don't know, I feel it when I go back home. I feel that I'm different. Yeah, I get that. And that they don't quite like it. But I don't quite care anymore.
The work that I do in the Presbyterian Church, I sometimes say our work is actually harder now, maybe because of the progress. Because complacency is a lot harder to combat than outright confrontation.
Let's take the 80s, for example, when you literally see men falling dead on the streets, there's no time for complacency. You've got to do something. You've got to beat on the doors of the White House and say, open up the money. Get this money in for research. We don't see that right now, unless you're a member of the trans community or paying attention. And again, for everybody here, but especially if you're lesbian, gay, or bisexual, start paying attention. Because I promise you, if it was okay to say that about me, they would have been saying it about me. I promise you that when they go back to their office behind closed doors, they are saying it about me. That's one of the things that I appreciate, and I want to make sure this comes out correctly now that I'm about to say it, about where I grew up and when I grew up, is I know what's said behind closed doors. I was kind of like a spy that they didn't know. I heard everything that was said. I know what they say about particularly gay men. I know what they say, what they think. So you just deal with it. You beat them. And while we're in a 3 steps forward and we're in a 1 step back phase right now, we're still winning. We're still winning.
Someone asks, how do we counter the overused but sometimes persuasive argument that says parental rights should control? In other words, the parent a person doesn't necessarily have the right to live their. A kid may say they want to live their authentic life, but this is really about parental rights to control their children until they're of age.
What's funny is that and I'm going to say majority party, we don't use the terms in Jefferson City to try to keep it civil. The week before we voted on the trans bill, we voted on the Parents' Bill of Rights when it comes to schools. And a parent has the right to take their kid out of any class or to say, I don't want them taught that or this. They get all the lesson plans, and because parents always know best, is what my colleague said. Well, first of all, no. I've met some parents that do not know best. But then the very next week, up comes this trans bill. And suddenly we have parents of trans kids saying, the medical community says that this is appropriate. The psychological community says this is appropriate. I say this is appropriate, and my kid says this is what he or she wants. But 24 of my colleagues knew better than the entire medical community. The same people that can perform open heart surgery on you, take your heart out, put it back in, and these 24 are going to overrule them. So parents had no say this next week. And so I think that idea of parental rights is used when convenient. Somebody said instead of the current logo, perhaps the majority party should be a pretzel as their logo because they can twist themselves. It's remarkable sometimes.
You know, to push back a little bit, though, some of those issues, especially on the trans sports bills, but to some degree the health ones as well, had some bipartisan support. Maybe not in the Democratic caucus in the Missouri Senate, but with voters, those issues are being used partly because they're polling
really
across
well.
the aisle. It isn't a strictly partisan issue, which is, I guess, how do you respond to that? Like, what is happening that these issues are finding that kind of resonance, even with people who think of themselves as liberal?
Sure. Well, I think one thing is it's new to most people, and I think we all have a little hesitancy with things that are new, little apprehension. I think this was terrible timing and set the trans community back much farther than we realized, and this is not going to be a politically correct thing for a liberal to say. But the swimmer that won the NCAA national championship, I forget her name, that was the poster child that they were waiting for, and it devastated the trans community. That was an awful thing to have happened, in my opinion, big picture-wise. Now, if you polled Missourians right now, I bet you 80% are opposed to my point of view. 80% of Missourians would not have liked the 3-day filibuster that I led. But then ask them what were their top 10 priorities for the legislature last year, because leadership said their number one priority was trans health care. That was their number one objective. I guarantee you of those 80%, less than 10% of those had that anywhere on their top 10 list. Yes, they're opposed to what I'm advocating, but how much do they care? And I think we can look at the last U.S. Senate race. The very first ad Vicki Hartzler put out statewide was how anti-trans she was. That's how she introduced herself to the rest of the state, and she came in a distant third. The 80% disagree with me, but they don't really care at the end of the day. Also, in 10 years, that's going to be closer to 50-50, and 10 years after that, it's going to be more like 70-30. And privately, I have a lot of colleagues that agree with that.
So my last question. Give this audience a picture that represents the way you want it to be, that maybe you've had a chance to see just a glimpse of in your time in the last year or two. There's been a lot of bleakness. There's been a lot of discouraging setbacks. Is there a story, a person who you've talked to who shows you some hope?
Yeah, there's this very active rabbi in St. Louis who has a trans son. I'm trying to think if I should say his name or not. I won't say his name. But the trans boy is just the cutest little kid you've ever seen. And I'm not sure I would have done this personally, but they came to the Capitol one day to go see the most adamant anti-trans legislators. And it was essentially say this to my kid's face. Well, they did. They did say it to his face. And so I was the last stop, and I'm often the last stop of the day. I give lots and lots of hugs. And so the three of us are sitting around the little table there in my office, and the rabbi and I are talking, and his son interrupts and says, "Why do these people hate me so much?" So now I'm trying to think of how I explain this to him. And I talk about, people are scared of folks that are different. You and I are different. And so we scare them a little bit. And we're talking, and I looked at his dad and I said, "Can we just take a walk, just the two of us?" And so I'm going to say his name. I'm going to slip and say it. So we stood up and walked out, and walking down the hall of the Capitol, just kind of holding his hand, talking to him about what's going on, because I was not going to let that kid leave that building thinking that it's a place where bad people come and do bad things. He has to know that it's a place where people are there standing up for him. Even when we lose, we're there, and we're fighting, and we're making their lives difficult. And I walk him right onto the Senate floor. And as a guest of a senator, there's a spot where you can stand and sit. And I'm explaining to him what's going on, and that's my desk. And, he's smaller for his age. And I look up at the dais, and there happens to be just the right Republican up there that would be okay with this. And I text him the story, and it's like, "Can I bring this kid up there?" And he's like, "Of course." And so there we go. We walk on the floor up to the dais. Senator Huff lifts him up, holds him with one arm, is showing him all the buttons up there. And to get the floor, to get control of the floor when it's open, you stand and say, "Mr. President." And if there's multiple people that do it, the first audible person to say it gets the floor, and that's totally up to the person behind the dais. So he explains this to the boy, and he says, "They're about to stop talking. You've got to pick the next person." Well, he thought this was the biggest thing. He got to pick. He picked the right person, but it was also the wrong person. We didn't want to hear from him, but he did what he was told. So he got to run the Senate for a second. And we get back to the office, and he's just grinning from ear to ear. And his dad, the rabbi, said, "I got this text that says, 'Why in the world is your son on the dais running the Senate all of a sudden?'" And he said, "What happened?" And I was trying to tell him the story. And so they left just happy. And one day, and this is the part that'll make me tear up. So Dad called me a few weeks later and said that his son is not into music or sports. It's not like posters all over the wall. But they took a picture of the two of us, and he wanted that blown up poster size. And so that's his poster on the wall. One of these days, he's going to be active and make a difference in the world. And I hope that story has a little something to do with it.
Senator Greg Razer, thank you so much for this
Thank you.
conversation.
Thank you.